the world is just a lot more volatile, right? And it's not energy sector specific, but we've got such an incredible challenge in Australia and globally about the scale of investment we need to get to net zero by 2050.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora in APAC. We're very much looking forward to today's discussion. We have Benn Barr in today. He's the Chief Executive of the Australian Energy Market Commission, the rulemaker in the Australian energy markets. Prior to the AEMC, Ben was Deputy Director General in the Queensland Department of Natural Resources, Mines and Energy. Ben's organisation analyses and decides on any proposed rule changes in Australia's electricity and gas markets, an increasingly crucial and central role given the widespread recognition that reforms will be necessary to deliver reliable energy to consumers efficiently throughout the energy transition. This conversation will largely focus on the reform agenda for the national electricity market in Australia. Ben, welcome to Energy Unplugged. Delighted you can join us.
Thanks so much for having me, Hugo. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
We're also joined today by James Haar, Aurora's market lead in the Australian team and formerly at one of Australia's leading think tanks, the Grattan Institute. Hi, James.
Hey, Hugo. Good to be here.
Maybe let me start with the current priorities for the AEMC, Ben. The role of rulemakers is always a tough one, and I hear generally two criticisms of rulemaking bodies across geographies. They're either changing too much too quickly and we need more stability, or they're not moving fast enough and not keeping up with technology and those types of things. And sometimes those criticisms are offered simultaneously. How do you think about rapid market evolution whilst also providing stability and consistency for investment decisions?
Yeah, thanks, Hugo. That's a great question. And it's also, that's our job, right? So that's the environment we're in. And I don't think there's a day I don't wake up and I'm like, go faster. So I totally understand those dual things that we need to balance because the world is moving really fast. There's a lot to get on with in the transition, but you do need a level of stability in the regulatory framework for investors. And so I think what we do at the Australian Energy Market Commission is make sure we're really deliberative about it. And sometimes you have to take risk and go faster. Other times you're making decisions in uncertainty and you want to build and adapt and build on reforms as you go. And I think the work we've done in ancillary services markets, we call it the essential system services work in Australia, is a good example of building and doing the building blocks for reform in a really methodical way, but engaging industry as we go. And other things, you've got to take a bit more risk. But actually what slows you down, and it's important to do, is you've got to explain what you're doing to industry, to consumers, because if you don't, that's when the reform agenda gets away from you. So it's a challenge, but that's why we're here.
Yep, absolutely.
So Ben, one of the things I'd like to just get a little bit, dive a bit deeper into is the fact that it's potentially going to be less of a smooth transition than we might have naively hoped a little while ago. And one of the ways in which that's crystallized in June this year was that we actually had the market suspended for 9 whole days, where the market operator had to step in, they had to centrally control dispatch of electricity. And obviously this is unprecedented in the NEM's history. One reflection on this crisis is that events like this tend to provide impetus for major reforms. And it's pretty early days since the crisis, but what do you think is going to be the long-term impact of the market suspension? Do you think it's going to accelerate transition to green? Do you think there's going to be more emphasis on, for example, system resilience? How do you think this is going to play out?
Yeah, thanks, James. I mean, June feels like a long time ago, to be honest. A lot has happened, and you're right. I think it was truly shocking, to be honest, that the market was suspended, and something that the cascading way that it happened in Australia, starting out in Queensland with one of the mechanisms that's supposed to actually support stability of the market, the cumulative price threshold, then administered pricing flowing through all of the different interconnected regions, and then eventually AEMO, and Daniel Westerman and his crew at AEMO deserve a shout out for the work they did during market suspension. And in some ways, they almost did too good a job, because I think people think that we're all back to smooth sailing now. And I agree with your starting premise. The world is just a lot more volatile, right? And it's not energy sector specific, but we've got such an incredible challenge in Australia and globally about the scale of investment we need to get to net zero by 2050. And so that volatility outside of the sector, whether it's a war in Europe or high inflation or weather events that you just have to accept that they're going to be more extreme as part of the norm, all of that makes those challenges harder. But that crisis, which I think shocked us all in the sector, does offer you that chance for speeding up reform. And so we had an energy ministers meeting on the 12th of August, and it was a great meeting. And if you really want to, you can have a look at the communique, and it's a really significant communique. And I think the three key things out of that, which bode well for long-term reform, are absolutely the need to speed up the transition to net zero in Australia. And you saw ministers for the first time, and for a very, very long time, agree to change the objectives for energy rules in Australia. So they're going to include an emissions objective into that. There's a coordinated national plan on the transition, which isn't done, but they've agreed to establish it, which is a really important reform. So that's one set of reforms, which I think is really important. Secondly, the second set is around how do you smooth out the bumps in that transition? What further resilience do you need? And I'd load into that a number of things. The capacity mechanism, which was kind of very controversial, I think, before the crisis. It's still controversial, but for different reasons. But actually, a lot of people who were saying Australia didn't need a capacity mechanism in the lead up to the crisis, because we were actually worried about other things in the lead up to the crisis, and during the crisis said, actually, no, we need this change to the system. I think that's really important. And we're doing work around looking at some of those rules to the system that should provide resilience, and are they fit for purpose when things are more volatile. So we're looking at things like retailer of last resort schemes. We're looking at the settings around price caps. Are they fit for purpose in this world? And that's really important. And the last set of reforms is to the gas market. And so, like in a lot of markets, the gas and electricity markets in Australia are linked, are very closely linked. And they're not the same, though. And so, what ministers said was, we need more transparency in that gas market. We need more options for the operator to actually make sure there's enough storage in the system, and actually make sure that they can see what's coming in the gas market. And I think all three of those sets of reforms are really important, and also lots of momentum to get on with them too. So that's good.
Ben, just to follow up there, and particularly your second point around smoothing the bumps, which we've talked a lot about on this podcast previously. We're recording this in late August, and just today, the ESOO, the Electricity Statement of Opportunities, has come out today in Australia. And this is a document AEMO, the market operator, put out once a year that identifies risks to reliability, and reliability being quite a narrow way. I noted there you talked about resilience, which is obviously just more than peak megawatts at times of peak demand. And the ESOO did flag that there were potential security of supply concerns moving forward. Do you think that adds weight to your second point, and not necessarily that capacity markets are the solution to every problem, but that we do need some more guardrails around the transition to give people the tools they need to proactively address these issues?
I think so. And, what the Statement of Opportunities is supposed to do is send a signal out to the market to say, invest, actually, we're short. And so, I'm really hoping it plays that role into people looking to invest to make those decisions. But even if you make a decision to invest, it actually takes a while to get your project built. And so more guardrails to smooth out the bumps for customers, right? Like, I don't think, we live in a volatile world, but energy shouldn't really ideally be a volatile commodity for customers. And it's tricky because you've got a regulated monopoly part, which is the networks, and then you've got a bit that's commodity linked, usually, whether it's coal or gas. And so how do you make sure that you get the investment in the timing that you need? How do you smooth out the bumps for customers so that there aren't wild fluctuations in the prices that they follow? I think that's a job for anyone in policymaking in energy.
And presumably you're looking across to Europe now, and some of the statistics around rising electricity prices and fuel poverty are really heartbreaking. There are clearly a series of businesses that are going to struggle or go under in the next 12 months in Europe. And Australia hasn't got to that stage yet, but I'm sure you're following that closely.
Yeah, absolutely. We particularly talk to Ofgem in the UK a lot, but we also talk to similar regulators, not just in Europe, but in the US and around the world. And I know in Europe, they're talking about, I think at the EU, big reforms potentially to the market in the next couple of days. We're keeping a close eye on that. And Australia is very lucky in one sense. It's a very rich energy intensive industry, but I think what we learned from the situation in June is, like, all global markets are very connected, and the electrons are tight everywhere, right? With the situation in Europe and Russia and the Ukraine, it's actually getting energy at all times, not the peak demand challenge that we faced traditionally in summer. This was the issue with June, was usually you're worried about blackouts in Australia over summer, you're worried about peak demand. The problem we had in June was actually just energy, just getting enough energy out the door during all times of the day. And that's a different challenge for Australia than we've traditionally faced.
Yeah, and to pick up on one of your earlier points there, Ben, about making sure that regulations are fit for purpose, particularly striking in that crisis was to see the link between electricity and gas, and having a gas price cap that was led to a short-run cost for gas producers that was, for electricity generation from gas that was above the price cap in the electricity market, seems to have played a role in precipitating that crisis. Just to turn to an earlier outcome of the market suspension that you brought up, you talked about the fact that we're now looking likely that there'll be an emissions objective or a sustainability objective built into the national energy objectives, and these are these form the core principles that AEMC has to take consideration of when it's making rules, and expanding the rules. Expanding the objectives so that they're not just focused on price, quality, safety, and reliability, but also taking account of emissions would be a first since the creation of the NEM. How do you think, in practical terms, this change will affect the way that the AEMC analyzes and makes rules in the markets?
Yeah, thanks, James. It is a really profound change, I think, and the most significant change to those objectives in my time in working in the sector. I think practically for us, we've been grappling with this for a while, even though the objective hasn't changed. You don't make rules in the absence of what states and territories in Australia are driving towards, and so the thing that really kind of spurred us on to this was we actually had settlement in Australia through all jurisdictions of net zero to 2050 at the back end of 21. And so energy ministers in Australia are the strategic policy setters. And so if they're all saying that's the general direction, then we as a rulemaker can take that into account, even though it's not explicitly in the objectives. But it's a bit of a workaround. And so what this will do will be able to make it more explicit. And I think not just us, but also we're one of three market bodies in Australia. We've got the Australian Energy Regulator and AEMO, who's the operator. And I think it'll allow us all to have a consistent view of how we should interpret those objectives. And so, we've already For some of our rule changes, we're doing a rule change on hydrogen into the gas networks, and one of our criteria were actually it's got to help decarbonisation. So we could take it into account, but I think the rule change, and we need to see the detail that ministers agree to, will just allow us to be far more upfront and transparent with how commissioners make those decisions.
Then we've talked a little bit there about kind of the role of rule makers and the current crisis and what's come out of it. Maybe if we could flip now to some of the more structural reforms that are being suggested on the east coast of Australia. And I think the ones that are getting the most airtime are capacity markets, which we've touched on, transmission, getting it built on time, on budget, but not gold plating, and then nodal pricing. Just before we get into each of those in turn, and this is a bit inside baseball, but I always like to ask people like you, as a market modeling company, where do you think market modelers are helpful and unhelpful in informing debates around redesign? And I think in Australia, maybe modeling has been weaponized, not just in energy, but generally. And so often it is, I think, more unhelpful than helpful.
I mean, you stole kind of my answer in the weaponization of modelling, to be honest. I love the inside baseball reference too. That's a very, I think inside baseball reference for the energy sector is right, because it is all arcane insider knowledge. It's still really important. Like, market modelling is still really important, but it's a tool. It's not the answer. And I think the weaponization you talk about is when people look to it to go, here's the answer. And really, what I like about it is it should force you to be upfront about the assumptions you're making around your policy design, and then it's telling you the direction of travel that you need to go in, and what the cost and benefits of some of those policy choices are. But it doesn't tell you what, you can't use it as this is the answer and this is the right answer. And, usually you can't also say, and I guarantee the impact on customers is going to be X, Y, Z. I mean, I think that there where it gets taken out of context. And for us, though, it's a really, really important, and I like to talk about two things you need as a policymaker. You need the data that the modelling gives you, and you need a dialogue. You need a dialogue around what that data means, and we need to go out and talk to industry and go, well, here's what the model shows us, but can you invest in this complex market design, for example, or is it too complex for you to invest? And one thing we're doing at the Commission, which a market model doesn't tell you, is, okay, you make a change to the market. What's the timing of that change? How do you actually implement it? How complex is it? And how confident are you in the implementation that you can actually get the benefits that your model shows you? So modelling can't give you that answer, but it can really, really inform policymakers about the trade-offs that they need to make. But again, it doesn't tell you what the perfect market design is.
No, completely agree. The other thing I'd say, and this is a broader point, but James in particular has been leading a lot of our work with state governments in Australia, and I think we're thinking increasingly hard about out of equilibrium outcomes. So when you use market models to model the future, and everyone has perfect foresight and gets their cost of capital back, and I think it's not just about testing what if the commodity price is different, but what if the market outcomes are just actually radically different from what your model says? And, how much could that wind up costing the consumer both ways? And I think a great example of this, again, in Europe at the moment, is that CFDs are actually paying back enormous amounts of money to British consumers, which no one thought about when they were writing, £100 contracts to offshore wind 2 or 3 years ago. So, that is an extreme outcome, but it is, the markets are out of equilibrium. And I think that kind of analysis sheds quite interesting insight as well.
I agree. Like it's you should be using it for scenario planning around, it is a very uncertain world. And to think your model can get back to equilibrium with certainty. But you want to be forcing it to do things which gives you a sense of what the extremes of outcomes might look like.
To turn then to the specific reform, so capacity markets getting a lot of attention, have been suggested by the Energy Security Board, and the initial designs were a little bit more like the UK model, but it looks like state and federal may be pivoting a little bit more to a French model, but those comparisons aren't perfect. in your mind, what are the pros and cons of capacity markets? And then, particularly where Europe has tried out a couple of different models, have you guys looked across and said, we like elements of this, we've seen this work well? What other markets do you look to as good comparators or examples for Australia?
Yeah. First, I listened to your capacity mechanism deep dive from a couple of weeks ago. That was great. I've passed that one on to a few people actually. I thought it was really good. I think the advantages are with the scale of the transition and the volatility. How do you provide a bit more certainty around investment that you need? I mean, that's my layperson's reason we're looking at it. And I think somebody made the point in that podcast, I think, that Australia's kind of got capacity support already, right? So, for those internationally, Australia's, very proud of its energy-only market, but states and territories have been investing in firming generation renewables in Australia via different sort of mechanisms for a while now. And so, and I think that's a recognition of the scale of the challenge. And so that to me is the big advantage of whatever sort of capacity mechanism you've got. We haven't had a lot of investment in firming technology in Australia. We're getting a fair bit in batteries, in large batteries, short run batteries, but there are big challenges with the transition on particularly long duration storage and what you do around that when we have coal exit from the system. So that to me is its big upside. It has downsides, and so there are lots of good things in the energy only market in Australia that you need to consider when you're transitioning to capacity markets, like the signal it gives you for things like storage and demand response is actually pretty useful. And if you look at, the system operator's view on what we need to do to get to net zero by 2050, you need a lot of demand side response. You need a lot of integration of batteries at quite staggering scale. So how you do that, and coming back to your other point, actually, the way, if you don't have a long run contract at the moment on your renewable plant, you're doing pretty well out of the energy only market. And there's a lot of complexity in capacity markets about what you do in auctions and what you do with derating of technologies, which you need to consider very carefully. And I'm at the Commission and at the Energy Security Board, which we're a member of, absolutely looking around at other markets, not just in Europe, certainly Great Britain, Ireland, France, having a look at those markets, but also the US and also Western Australia. So we've actually got a capacity market in Australia over in the West there. I think West Australians keep telling us if only you'd done what we've done on gas and capacity markets, you wouldn't have these problems on the East Coast of Australia. But I think we're very conscious too that it's not a blank sheet of paper, and you can't just pick up another markets model and apply it to Australia and think all your problems will be solved. You need to work through the specific problems in the Australian market. And it is I think you pointed out, it's a very long, skinny, geographically dispersed network, and Townsville in the north is nothing like Toorak in the south, right? So you really need to think through those complexities when you're thinking about market design. And what problems you're trying to solve too. I think that was another good point you made in your podcast around how many problems do you want to solve with your capacity market, being really clear on that.
So Ben, capacity markets are great insofar as we have overseas comparisons that we can draw on and learnings we can take from other countries. But turning to the second of the big reform topics in Australia, it feels like a topic where perhaps no one seems to be getting it right, and that is transmission, and in particular, getting transmission built at the speed that's necessary to unlock renewable capacity, to replace the retiring thermal plant, but at the same time, making sure we get the infrastructure in the right places at the right times, and ideally at the right price. We've seen a little bit of splintering in Australia over the last couple of years in terms of how different governments are approaching the approvals process for transmission. So historically, we've had the RIT-T test, which is the regulated test that allows the transmission network service providers to invest in new transmission. But there is talk, from the new federal government about they have a $20 billion fund that they want to use to provide low-cost debt to accelerate transmission rollout. And the New South Wales and Victorian governments have gone down quite different paths and given themselves powers to essentially bypass this test for transmission projects that they think would deliver consumer benefits, distinct from perhaps the more social benefits or the social welfare that the RIT-T analyzes. So how do you guys think about this challenge and about getting transmission in on time, but also without gold plating the system?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $64 billion question, right? So you want to bring forward the transmission spend, but you still want to make sure it's efficient and customers aren't paying for more than they need to. So yes, very easy to say and hard to do. We've got a big review at the moment. It's one of our biggest pieces of work, and a real focus for the Commission is on transmission planning and investment. And so that very issue around that regulatory investment test and the entire economic assessment framework in Australia, it is really complex. The time it takes you from a project being identified in what we call the integrated system plan to, a sod turning, and the steps that you need to go through. It's not just the RIT-T, it could be the contingent project assessment, or it might be a cost benefit analysis as part of the ISP. We're looking at what parts of that, from go to woe economic assessment framework could you streamline, could you possibly do away with, but still make sure that there is real rigor in what projects get built. So I have to say, you don't have to wait long. Couple of weeks in Australia, and we'll have a draft report out in the middle of September where we'll go through those issues in a lot of depth.
Awesome. And just to pick up on your point before about scenario analysis, just a quick one. Do you think that the risks here are asymmetric? Do you think that the outcomes will be worse if transmission is late rather than a couple of years too early?
Yeah, I think we definitely, the base case here that we consider is, what if the transmission's not there? We're definitely thinking about that when we're looking at the problem. It's not just assume if it's late, the current prices just continue on. We're definitely considering what happens if transmission's late. I think the thing with it is they're very long-lived assets. There's a lot of them, and there's competition for the provision of the services in the terms of you're getting more large storage and you're getting more generation out there. But that said, you look at the integrated system plan, you look at the scale of the build, you look at where it is in Australia, how much of it, and you need more transmission and you need it faster. I don't think anyone's disagreeing with that.
The third of the topics is nodal pricing. You talked about Australia's almost uniquely long, thin grid, like the amount of land we cover, but the sparse population, relatively speaking, and so there is discussion of sharper locational price signals. Australia, it should be noted, actually does already have some location signals, marginal loss factors, thermal grid curtailment, things like that. But this was something that came out of the ESB proposal as a suggestion. My theory about this is is that, if you were starting with a clean sheet of paper, as you said, and you knew you had to build, gigawatts of renewables, you'd probably go down the nodal path because you'd want a locational signal. But as you progress and more of the stuff gets built, and potentially you have more direct intervention in the form of reses to kind of control and manage the influx of gigawatts of renewables into a system, arguably the arguments for nodal kind of diminish a little bit over time, I think. I suppose, again, a bit like capacity markets, what's your take on the pros and cons of nodal, and how do you think about it impacting existing assets where people have made decisions based on a certain set of rules versus future people who might benefit from sharper locational signals?
Yeah, I think people are wound up on the sharper locational signal, and I think it's certainly super hot topic, and it's not even ESB. This access reform is what we call it in the Commission's been around for ages. We've been pushing it, and to be honest, I think we could have done a far better job in explaining it over the years, and we've got a lot of pushback on it. And I think that argument that you outline is really a good one to consider. It's that transition and implementation from the current system to any future system and what you do about it. That said, I probably strongly disagree with the fact that it's going to get better over time. Again, have a look at the ISP and the absolute scale of generation, and inside a res and outside a res, you've got a problem. And so because people can free ride off your renewable energy zone by building just outside it, how much generation gets away into the main part of the system. So I think what the Energy Security Board has done a really good job on, though, is what I talked about earlier, is really explaining the problem. Because when we started on this journey, people were just like, there is no problem and you people are crazy. And I think where the Energy Security Board has got to is a recognition from industry that there are problems. There's two problems around congestion in the system. One is in the investment time frame. So you're making this choice to build your wind farm, and you invest in it, and then 3 months later, you get another 17 projects that chew up your line. So how do you deal with that? And the Energy Security Board's got a couple of models to deal with that. And then you've got a real-time issue for congestion and dispatch. And that's the one around, sharper price signals. That is probably the most contested. And again, we've got buy-in now that is a problem, and it's just the solution that we're working on. So I think that's really good progress. And John Cole from Edify's team, who again I think was on your podcast previously, they came up with a variation on this, which was a voluntary congestion relief market. So a new market, like an ancillary services market, which is, fair play to John and the team. That's what you want from industry, is them not just throwing stones at rule makers, but coming up with some solutions, saying, actually, people know what ancillary markets are. This is not a big change, and you can, participate in it if you want to. And it's the thing about that is getting that right is actually great for the transition, because that will incentivize more storage in those renewable energy zones you talk about, because they can take advantage of those congestion signals and charge their storage when there's not congestion, and release it when there is. So I think the ESB have done a good job in making a lot of headway on a very, very contested reform, and there's still a way to go. But I just like to say, I think they've done a good job in getting industry engaged in the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is increased. I mean, my understanding is it's being considered in the UK now. There's discussions across the EU. Most of the US markets are reasonably nodal. They kind of did that, late 90s, early 2000s, so less contentious there. But as you say, it's prompted some strong responses.
On the topic of getting stakeholder buy-in and having industry come along with you, I mean, you've got quite a long history of working with governments, both federal and state, and that means quite a lot more stakeholders than, for example, in Great Britain, where once you get Ofgem and BEIS and the minister lined up, you can pretty quickly get a reform through. So on balance, do you think that the fact the NEM is a shared responsibility for state and federal government produces better or worse outcomes for Australian consumers than if we're wholly managed at a federal level?
Yeah, I love a question about federalism. This is super nerdy, even for me. I've worked at the federal level. I've worked in a state government in Australia, and I think it's a very big country. And the reason you have a federal system usually is because it's big geographically. And it might seem simple just to say one answer, move quickly, but energy is an essential service, and you need buy-in across the entire country. And in Australia, it's really those states that do service delivery, and the Commonwealth and the federal government's got a critically important role about thinking about the national interests and looking across the entire country. But you get, I think, better longer-term outcomes with the involvement in all those states and territories and the Commonwealth government. You also get the advantage of policy experimentation. So actually, when I was in Queensland, one of the states here, we were always looking at what's happening in South Australia and going, what can we steal from them? So it's like any kind of government model. It's got its strengths, it's got its weaknesses. Sometimes it can be frustrating, but if you know how to work it and you look around and you're willing to do the hard yards, you can, I think, actually make really significant reform right across the system.
Yeah, and I think that manifests itself in all sorts of ways, right? Everything from auction design for renewables, treatment of batteries and those types of things. So, it's certainly played out in Australia over the last couple of years.
One more insider's perspective, perhaps, if you can give it to us, Ben. I'm sure you've been to many of the energy ministers' forums over the years. What's something that the people who are in the industry but outside the tent of government, what's something that they should understand about the decision-making process that's going on when the various ministers from each of the jurisdictions meet?
Yeah, I have been to a lot. I think, like, all of those ministers really want to get an outcome. I think that's the thing. I think if people have a view that they're not interested in working together and getting an outcome, that I can just say that's not true. They're really keen to make serious reform, and it's a continuum. Like that, those meetings are the apex of reform. And I think for industry stakeholders in Australia, getting involved in that and getting your views across on the reform agenda in a really constructive way about what you think should change is really, really useful. When I was in Queensland, we used to run, and they still run, I think, industry forums in the lead up to those meetings. And often the minister would quote what people were saying in those forums. So do not underestimate your voice if you engage in the process, right? Like, so that's the call out, I would say. That ministers are always listening. So get involved, make a difference. It's unique to Australia, I think, the fact that you can actually meet a lot of the energy ministers. They are out and about, and you might run into Lily D'Ambrosio at a function, or, Mick DeBrenny. It's a function of how small the industry is, but great opportunities to have, real impact and help shape the debate. Yeah, and they all want to listen too, I think. Yeah, like they genuinely do. So I just think, and the sector is better when people engage constructively in it. So it can be frustrating, I know, because sometimes people's own personal thing doesn't get across. But I say just keep going. No, absolutely. One final question that we ask all, or I ask all people who come on: who do you read or listen to in the energy space that you think is always good, thought-provoking, and really critically kind of relevant to your work as a regulator? Yeah, no, that's a good question. So a few people, some of which have been on your pod, I think. So definitely Tony Wood at Grattan. I know James worked with Tony before, but I think Tony is always super interesting. Like, I did work with Tony like in the early thousands when he was at Clinton Foundation, and he's always super constructive on policy reform and really considered. Paul Simshauser, who, I don't know how he sleeps, churns out academic articles all the time. And again, when he was in AGL, I think was really thinking about industry's role in this being an essential service and not just a company line. So I think Paul's always good to have a listen to. Lynn Gallagher at Energy Consumers Australia is always good, always out there. And I think internationally, Feridun Suisachi, who was regularly putting out books from Molino Energy, they're always worth a read and super interesting. That's a great list, and particularly that last one I'll have to dig up. Ben, thank you so much for your time today. We've covered a lot in 40 minutes. You're running what is definitely one of the busiest organisations in the Australian energy space. So we're very appreciative of your time. All the best, and thanks again. Thanks so much, Hugo. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Ben.
That was Hugo Batten, Aurora's Managing Director for APAC, talking to Benn Barr, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Energy Market Commission, and James Haar, Aurora's Market Lead in the Australian team. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.